something inside you stopped carrying weight. Not dramatically, not all at once, just quietly enough that you keep questioning whether it really happened. The thoughts are still there, the explanations still form, the familiar inner voice still speaks, but when it does, nothing moves. No shift in behavior, no emotional alignment, no sense of direction following behind it. The words arrive, but they land without authority. This is not confusion. It only looks like confusion because you're still expecting clarity to come from the same place it always did. What actually failed is subtler than that. Your inner narrative, the story you use to organize your decisions, your effort, your patience, has stopped being recognized by your system as binding. It still exists, but it no longer governs. And the unsettling part is that nothing outside of you had to change for this to occur. That loss of authority is the threshold, and it always arrives before anything visible shifts. An inner narrative is not a belief system. It is not motivation. It is not even self-talk in the way most people think about it. It is closer to an internal contract between your perception and reality. As long as that contract holds, life feels navigable. You may not feel happy or inspired, but things make sense. Effort leads somewhere. Endurance has a reason. Waiting feels temporary rather than pointless. For a long time, your inner narrative did its job. It told you why discomfort was acceptable. It explained why certain sacrifices mattered. It translated uncertainty into tolerable delay. It didn't need to promise success or meaning. It only needed to create coherence. As long as reality responded in roughly the way the narrative predicted, the system stayed aligned. What breaks that alignment is not failure. That's a common misunderstanding. Catastrophic failure often strengthens narratives. People endure hardship when they believe it confirms the story they are living inside. What erodes narrative authority is something quieter and more corrosive. Repeated, low-grade mismatch. You do the right things, and nothing adjusts. You wait, and the situation does not evolve. You apply the same reasoning that once worked, and reality returns something flat, neutral, or irrelevant. Not rejection, not punishment, just absence of response. At first, this doesn't feel threatening. The mind treats it as noise. It assumes the delay is temporary, the signal is delayed, or the interpretation needs refinement, so the narrative keeps running. It continues to explain. It continues to justify effort. It continues to interpret discomfort as transitional. This is the crucial part. The system does not revoke trust all at once. It observes. Every time the narrative predicts relief that doesn't arrive, a small discrepancy is logged. Every time meaning is assigned but not confirmed, another inconsistency accumulates. None of these moments are dramatic enough to trigger alarm, but together, they form a pattern the system cannot ignore. Eventually, the inner narrative stops feeling like a reliable model and starts feeling like an assumption. This is where people often misdiagnose what's happening. They think the problem is mindset, gratitude, patience, or discipline. They assume the narrative failed because it wasn't positive enough, strong enough, or committed enough. But narratives don't lose authority because they are negative. They lose authority because they stop matching lived feedback. The system is pragmatic. It doesn't care whether a story is hopeful or bleak. It cares whether the story predicts outcomes accurately enough to justify energy investment. When it no longer does, the system doesn't revolt, it doesn't collapse, it quietly withdraws compliance. This withdrawal is subtle. Thoughts still form, explanations still sound logical. You can still articulate reasons for effort, but something underneath no longer moves. The body doesn't mobilize. The emotional charge doesn't follow. The sense of direction feels hollow. This is not resistance. Resistance implies conflict. What's happening here is non-recognition. The system hears the narrative, but it no longer treats it as binding. Think of it like instructions from a source that once had authority but no longer demonstrates accuracy. You don't argue with it. You don't rebel. You just stop acting on it automatically. You wait for confirmation that never comes. That's why this phase feels confusing in a specific way. You don't feel lost because you lack ideas. You feel lost because ideas no longer compel action. The old reasoning still sounds reasonable, but it no longer carries weight. This creates an internal lag. The narrative keeps speaking because it has always spoken, but the system has already downgraded its status. That downgrade happens below conscious awareness. By the time you notice something is wrong, the authority shift has already occurred. And this is important. The system does not remove authority maliciously. It does so to prevent further misallocation of energy. Continuing to invest in a narrative that no longer aligns with reality would create deeper exhaustion, resentment, or breakdown later. The withdrawal happens early, precisely to avoid that. This is why the experience feels calm but unsettling. There is no crisis, yet something essential is missing. The drive that once felt automatic is gone. The meaning that once organized effort has thinned out. You are still functional, but no longer convinced. When your inner narrative loses authority, it's not asking you to replace it immediately. It's signaling that the previous model has reached the limit of its usefulness. The system is no longer willing to be guided by explanations that no longer correspond to lived experience. Nothing is wrong with you here. There is no failure of character. There is no hidden deficiency. What you are experiencing is the mind doing exactly what it is designed to do, withdrawing trust from a structure that no longer predicts reality well enough to justify continued obedience. The discomfort comes from timing. Internally, the authority has already shifted. Externally, nothing has changed yet. You are living in the gap between those two events. And that gap is the threshold. The narrative still exists, but it no longer rules. The system isn't broken. It's waiting. When an inner narrative loses authority, the first thing people notice is not confusion, it's friction. A strange resistance to doing things that used to feel automatic. You sit down to work and nothing engages. You tell yourself the same reasons you always did, and the body doesn't respond. The mind interprets this as laziness, burnout, or lack of discipline. That interpretation is wrong, and it deepens the problem. What is actually happening is not a collapse of motivation. It is a collapse of translation. Motivation is not a raw resource that exists on its own. It is the result of an agreement between your nervous system and your internal explanations. When that agreement holds, effort feels available. When it breaks, effort feels inaccessible, regardless of how strong the reasons sound. For years, your nervous system learned that certain internal signals were trustworthy. A thought like, "This matters," used to produce energy. A thought like, "Keep going," used to mobilize endurance. A thought like, "This will make sense later," used to regulate discomfort. These were not abstract ideas. They were cues that triggered physiological readiness. When narrative authority erodes, those cues stop working. This is why the experience feels so personal and so frustrating. You are still issuing the same internal commands. You are still trying to activate the same responses, but the system no longer reacts. Not because it is defiant, but because it no longer recognizes the signal as valid. The nervous system is not persuaded by logic alone. It responds to patterns of safety, predictability, and outcome. When an internal narrative stops accurately forecasting what happens next, the nervous system quietly disengages from it. It stops allocating energy to instructions that no longer feel grounded. This disengagement is often misread as avoidance, but avoidance implies fear. What's happening here is closer to skepticism. The system has learned, through repetition, that the old reasons no longer lead where they claim to lead, so it withholds participation. This is why pushing harder makes things worse at this stage. Effort used to be reinforced by meaning. Now effort arrives alone. When you try to force action without internal credibility, the body registers strain without justification. That strain accumulates as irritation, fatigue, or numbness. You begin to feel like you're dragging yourself through tasks that no longer explain themselves. And because the culture around you equates struggle with virtue, you assume the problem is you. You try to apply discipline to a system that is no longer responding to discipline-based signals. This creates a secondary layer of tension. Not only is the narrative failing to motivate, but you begin to attack yourself for not responding to it. That self-pressure further convinces the nervous system that something is wrong with the signal. Compliance drops even more. It's important to understand that the nervous system is not designed to be loyal. It is designed to be efficient. It does not continue to mobilize energy for stories that no longer reduce uncertainty. Once the cost of believing exceeds the benefit of acting, it disengages. That disengagement feels like inertia. You may still show up externally. You may still perform basic functions. But internally, there is a lack of propulsion. The sense of being pulled forward by meaning is gone. This is deeply destabilizing because most people build their identity around being someone who responds to their own reasons. When that response disappears, it feels like a loss of self-control. But control was never the mechanism. Trust was. Your system trusted the narrative. That trust is now suspended. And suspension is not rejection. It's provisional. The system is waiting for something that makes sense again at a deeper level. Not louder reasons, not more convincing language, but explanations that align with actual experience. During this phase, even rest can feel strange. You're tired, but rest doesn't restore motivation. That's because rest only works when there is somewhere meaningful to return to. When the narrative has lost authority, there is no clear destination for recovered energy. This can lead to a flat, muted state, where nothing feels urgent but nothing feels satisfying either. That is not depression in the traditional sense. It is a pause in internal mobilization. The system has not shut down. It has stopped investing. And this is where people often panic and try to replace the narrative prematurely. They search for a new framework, a new explanation, a new identity that can restore momentum. But the nervous system is careful now. It does not grant authority easily after a failure. It waits for consistency. Until that consistency emerges, motivation will feel inaccessible, not because you are incapable, but because the system is conserving itself from further misalignment. This phase strips away the illusion that motivation is a personal trait. It reveals that motivation is conditional. It depends on trust between explanation and outcome. When that trust dissolves, effort becomes expensive. The mistake is treating this as a personal flaw instead of a systemic response. Your nervous system is not broken. It is doing exactly what it is designed to do when internal guidance stops matching reality. It is refusing to mobilize without credible direction. That refusal is uncomfortable, but it is not a dead end. It is the moment where old reasons stop working before new coherence has formed. When the inner narrative loses, authority and motivation stops translating into movement, another shift follows that is even more unsettling. The voice does not go away. It stays active. It continues to comment, explain, analyze, and evaluate. What changes is not the presence of the voice, but its position. Before, that voice functioned as a coordinator. It didn't just describe experience, it directed it. When it named something as important, the body aligned. When it framed something as temporary, discomfort softened. When it interpreted effort as meaningful, endurance followed. The voice wasn't just speaking. It was issuing signals that the rest of the system recognized as legitimate. Now that recognition is gone. The voice still speaks, but it speaks into a system that no longer treats it as an authority. This creates a strange internal configuration. Constant mental activity paired with a lack of follow-through. Thoughts feel busy, but nothing progresses. Analysis continues, but behavior remains flat. It feels like being talked at from inside your own head. This is where many people become deeply self-critical. They assume they are thinking too much or not thinking correctly. They try to silence the voice, control it, or replace it. But the problem is not the presence of thought. It is the loss of coupling between thought and action. What you are experiencing is decoupling. Decoupling happens when the system no longer believes that internal commentary reliably leads to outcomes. When that belief dissolves, the translation mechanism shuts down. The voice becomes observational rather than directive. It narrates, but it does not move anything. This can feel like paralysis, but paralysis implies blockage. What's actually happening is suspension. The system has paused its automatic responsiveness to interpretation. It is no longer willing to convert meaning into motion without evidence. This creates an internal split that feels unnatural, because for most of your life, thinking and acting were linked. Even hesitation had momentum. Even doubt still moved you somewhere. Now, thoughts come and go without consequence. That absence of consequence is what feels so destabilizing. You may notice yourself explaining why you should act, then watching yourself not act. Or you may notice self-criticism arise immediately after inaction, as if the voice is trying to regain control by increasing pressure. But pressure only highlights the loss of authority. The system doesn't respond to louder commands when credibility is gone. This is why attempts at forcing clarity often backfire. You try to reason your way back into alignment, but the reasoning has no leverage. It feels like arguing with yourself in a room where no one is listening. And importantly, this is not dissociation. You are not disconnected from reality. In many cases, perception becomes sharper. You notice more. You feel less compelled to interpret everything immediately. But because the old narrative framework is no longer organizing experience, perception feels uncontained. This uncontained perception can be misread as anxiety or emptiness. In reality, it is perception without assignment. The voice is still attempting to assign meaning, but the system is no longer accepting those assignments automatically. This is the phase where people often feel as if they are watching themselves more than being themselves. That language can sound dramatic, but the experience is very plain. You notice your own thoughts as events rather than commands. You notice reactions without immediately justifying them. You notice impulses without acting on them. None of this is intentional. It is the natural consequence of decoupling. The unsettling part is that the voice doesn't realize it has lost authority. It keeps operating as if it still governs. It evaluates your lack of response as failure, weakness, or avoidance. This creates internal tension because the system now has two layers running on different assumptions. The voice assumes compliance is still possible. The system knows it is not. This mismatch produces frustration that feels directionless. You're not fighting an external obstacle. You're not resisting a clear demand. You're simply no longer organized around internal commentary. That loss of organization can feel like identity erosion. If you defined yourself as someone who follows through, who responds to their own reasoning, who acts when things make sense, then this phase feels like a personal betrayal. But nothing has betrayed you. The mechanism has changed because the conditions changed. The system is not rejecting thought entirely. It is refusing to be governed by explanations that no longer feel anchored in reality. It is waiting for a form of understanding that does not require constant self-persuasion. Until that emerges, the voice remains active but downgraded. It becomes descriptive rather than directive. It can speak, but it cannot compel. This is why trying to silence the voice is unnecessary. Silence will not restore authority. Authority returns only when internal interpretation and lived experience realign. Until then, the voice's role is limited. What you are in is not a mental failure. It is a reconfiguration. Thought continues. Awareness continues. Function continues. But the old hierarchy is gone. And that absence is the threshold. The voice still exists. It just no longer runs the system. After the inner narrative loses authority and the voice decouples from action, the next destabilizing realization arrives quietly. Nothing outside has changed yet. Your environment looks the same. Your roles may still exist. Your routines may still be intact. From the outside, there is no clear reason for the internal shift you're experiencing. This mismatch is what makes the phase so difficult to trust. Human systems are trained to validate internal states through external markers. When something changes inside, we expect something to change outside to explain it. A loss, a failure, a disruption, a visible turning point. When none appears, the mind assumes the internal experience must be an error. But internal authority collapses before external conditions move, always. The inner narrative does not wait for proof before it withdraws trust. It responds to pattern degradation long before outcomes become obvious. By the time circumstances visibly shift, the narrative has usually been unstable for a long time. This creates a temporal gap that feels deeply unsettling. You feel as though you've already crossed a line that reality hasn't acknowledged yet. Your internal world has moved forward, but your external life remains frozen in a previous configuration. This is why people describe this phase as unreal. You feel ahead of your own life, but not in an aspirational way. More like you are living in the aftermath of something that hasn't happened yet. The mind struggles with this because it disrupts the usual cause and effect logic. Normally, something happens and you respond. Here, the response arrives first. The authority shift occurs internally before there is an external event to justify it. This is not anticipation. You are not expecting change. You are already living beyond the point where the old structure made sense. The world simply hasn't reorganized itself around that fact yet. Because nothing external has shifted, the system enters a state of quiet vigilance. You continue to show up. You continue to perform basic functions, but there is a subtle withdrawal of emotional investment. You stop taking things as seriously, not out of cynicism, but because the internal framework that once assigned significance is gone. This can look like detachment, but it is more accurately described as provisional engagement. You are present, but not committed in the same way. You participate without fully believing in the narrative that used to justify participation. This often creates guilt or self-doubt. You question why you feel distant from things that used to matter. You worry that you are becoming indifferent or ungrateful, but indifference is active dismissal. What you are experiencing is uncertainty about relevance. Your system no longer knows how to place meaning where it once did, and without external confirmation of change, it hesitates to fully disengage. This is the waiting room of identity. Externally, the world still expects you to operate under the old assumptions. Internally, those assumptions no longer hold authority. You are caught between two timelines, one that still exists socially and structurally, and one that has already expired psychologically. This is why forcing decisions during this phase often leads to regret. Choices made to resolve discomfort rather than reflect alignment tend to lock you into another version of the same mismatch. The system senses this and resists commitment. Nothing feels like the right move because the context that would make a move right has not arrived yet. And this is critical to understand. The discomfort here does not mean you are supposed to act. It means you are not supposed to pretend the old structure still works. The internal shift has already happened. Denying it because nothing external has changed only deepens the sense of unreality. The gap you are experiencing is not a mistake in perception. It is the natural delay between internal reorganization and external reconfiguration. Systems always update internally before they express change outwardly. This delay strips away false urgency. It exposes how much of your previous movement was driven by expectations that no longer apply. Without the old narrative, you are not compelled to rush toward explanations or outcomes. You are not behind. You are early. But early does not mean ready. And it does not mean visible. It means you are standing in the interval where internal authority has already shifted, but reality has not yet rearranged itself to reflect that shift. That interval feels empty because it is undefined. It has no clear language, no social markers, no validation. And yet, it is real. You are not imagining the loss of alignment. You are living in the lag between an internal ending and an external continuation. That lag is not meant to be resolved immediately. It is meant to be endured. When the inner narrative loses authority, and external reality hasn't shifted to explain it, another change becomes noticeable. Silence expands. Not the peaceful kind that feels restorative or meaningful, but a structural silence. The kind that appears when explanations stop rushing in to organize experience. This silence is often mistaken for emptiness. People describe it as numbness, flatness, or lack of emotion. But what has actually disappeared is not feeling itself. What has disappeared is automatic interpretation. Before this phase, almost everything you experienced was immediately framed. A sensation arrived, and the narrative explained it. Discomfort was labeled as temporary. Waiting was labeled as purposeful. Even confusion had a story attached to it. That constant framing created continuity. It made life feel as though it was always moving somewhere, even when nothing obvious was happening. When narrative authority collapses, that framing process slows down or stops altogether. Experiences still occur, sensations still register, thoughts still arise, but they are no longer instantly packaged into meaning. The system no longer rushes to tell you what something means or where it fits. This creates a wide, unfamiliar space around experience. That space is the silence. It can feel unsettling because you're no longer buffered by interpretation. There is nothing between you and the raw fact of what is happening. No justification, no reassurance, no storyline that explains why this moment is acceptable or necessary. This is why people often describe this phase as hollow, even when their life circumstances haven't worsened. It's not that life has lost content, it's that content has lost context. The silence reveals how much of your sense of self was constructed through ongoing narration. When that narration stops functioning, you are left with direct perception. And direct perception feels exposed because it lacks direction. Importantly, this silence is not imposed. It is not something you are doing or trying to maintain. It emerges naturally when the system no longer trusts its own explanations. Rather than generating interpretations, it no longer believes, it withholds them. This withholding can feel like detachment. You may notice yourself observing situations without the usual emotional pull. Things that once triggered strong reactions now register faintly. Conversations feel distant. Achievements feel neutral. Setbacks feel oddly muted. This does not mean you have stopped caring. It means the system is no longer assigning significance automatically. Significance used to be generated by the narrative. Without it, experience arrives unweighted. That unweighted state is uncomfortable because it removes hierarchy. Nothing feels clearly more important than anything else. Urgency dissolves. Priority becomes unclear. Without a narrative to rank experiences, everything feels equally undefined. This is often the moment people worry that something is wrong with them. They fear they are becoming apathetic, disconnected, or emotionally unavailable. But apathy is a defense against feeling. What you are experiencing is not defense. It is suspension. The system is suspended between meanings. This silence also exposes how much energy was spent maintaining coherence. When the narrative was active, it constantly smoothed contradictions, explained delays, and justified effort. Now that labor has stopped, the system is resting from interpretation. That rest can feel disorienting because it removes the sense of forward momentum. Without interpretation, time feels different. Days pass without clear markers. Progress feels irrelevant. You are no longer tracking yourself against an internal storyline. This can produce a subtle anxiety, not because something bad is happening, but because nothing is being resolved. Humans are conditioned to equate resolution with safety. Silence feels unsafe because it offers no conclusion. But this silence is not absence. It is capacity. In this quiet, the system is recalibrating what it will and will not assign meaning to. It is learning to tolerate experience without immediately organizing it. This is not a spiritual state. It is a psychological one, a pause in meaning-making. You may notice that attempts to force meaning during this phase feel intrusive. You try to interpret what the silence means, and the interpretation falls flat. It doesn't stick. It doesn't reassure. That's because the system is not ready to resume narrative construction yet. It has learned, through mismatch, that premature meaning leads to misalignment, so it waits. This waiting is not passive in the way people assume. It is observant. The system is watching reality without commentary, gathering data without interpretation. This is how trust is rebuilt, not through assertion, but through contact. The silence also strips away performative identity. Without an internal story, there is no role to maintain, no version of yourself to defend. You are not trying to be consistent with who you were. You are simply present, as you are. That presence can feel fragile because it lacks structure, but it is also precise. You respond to what is actually happening rather than what is supposed to be happening. This is why the silence feels heavy. It removes distraction without replacing it. It removes explanation without offering clarity. It does not comfort. It stabilizes. And stabilization without meaning feels strange. The key is to recognize that this silence is not asking to be filled. It is asking to be tolerated. It is the space where old meanings dissolve before new coherence forms. If you rush to fill it, you short-circuit the process. If you treat it as a failure, you fight it. But if you recognize it for what it is, a pause in narrative assignment, it becomes less threatening. Nothing has gone missing. Something has stepped back. The silence is not the end of identity. It is the moment identity stops talking long enough for something more accurate to take shape. After silence settles in and the system suspends automatic meaning, a new tension appears. It is subtle but persistent, the urge to replace what was lost. The mind does not like operating without a narrative for long. It begins searching for a substitute explanation, a new framework, a different identity that can restore coherence and momentum. This is where many people mistake movement for progress. When the old narrative collapses, there is a strong impulse to install a new one quickly, not because it is ready, but because the absence of structure feels intolerable. The system has been without authority long enough to feel exposed, and the mind interprets that exposure as danger. But the system itself is cautious now. It has learned that narratives can fail, that explanations can sound convincing while slowly drifting away from reality. Because of that, it does not grant authority easily. It does not accept replacements just because they are available. This creates internal resistance that feels confusing. You encounter new ideas, new identities, new directions that should feel energizing, yet they don't land. You understand them intellectually. You can even see how they might work. But something in you remains unmoved. This is not indecision. It is refusal to commit without trust. The system is no longer willing to organize itself around abstractions that have not proven themselves through experience. It has become conservative with belief. This is not cynicism, it is selectivity. Attempts to force a new narrative during this phase often feel artificial. You may notice yourself adopting new language, new explanations, new self-descriptions, only to feel a hollow echo behind them. The words don't anchor, they float, they sound borrowed. That hollowness is not a sign that the new narrative is wrong in an absolute sense. It is a sign that authority cannot be installed top-down anymore. The system will not accept a story simply because it sounds coherent. It requires alignment. Alignment emerges slowly. It forms when perception, action, and outcome begin to reinforce each other again. Until then, any narrative feels premature. This is deeply uncomfortable because the urge to resolve uncertainty is strong. The mind wants to label the silence, explain the detachment, and give the pause a purpose. But labeling too early recreates the same conditions that caused the collapse in the first place. The system senses this risk and resists. This resistance can feel like stagnation. You may worry that you are stuck, that you are failing to move forward, that you are missing opportunities. But stagnation implies that movement is available and being avoided. What is happening here is different. Movement without coherence is being rejected. The system is protecting itself from further fragmentation. It would rather remain in uncertainty than commit to another narrative that may eventually collapse under the same mismatch. This is why advice feels useless during this phase. Advice assumes a functioning narrative framework. It assumes goals, values, and priorities are already stable. When authority has collapsed, advice has nowhere to attach. You are not resistant to growth. You are resistant to premature structure. This phase often exposes how much of your previous identity was constructed through borrowed frameworks. You followed models that worked until they didn't. Now the system is insisting on something more grounded, even if it takes longer to form. This insistence is quiet. It does not argue. It does not demand. It simply withholds commitment. And withholding commitment is not the same as refusing change. It is refusing misalignment. You may notice that even things you genuinely want feel inaccessible. Desire exists, but direction does not. That's because desire alone is not enough to build a narrative. Desire needs context. It needs a sense of continuity. Without that, it remains abstract. This can make you feel disconnected from your own wants. You ask yourself what you want, and the answer feels vague or unstable. That is not because you have lost desire. It is because the system no longer trusts desire as a sufficient guide on its own. This phase is often misinterpreted as being lost. But being lost implies that a map exists and you are off it. What you are experiencing is the recognition that the old map no longer corresponds to the territory. Before a new map can be drawn, The system needs to observe without forcing interpretation. It needs to see what holds consistently, what repeats without explanation, what feels stable without being justified. That observation cannot be rushed. The refusal to install a new narrative is not a failure of imagination or courage. It is a recalibration of standards. Authority will return, but it will return differently. Not as a story you tell yourself, but as a pattern you recognize. Until then, the resistance remains. It is not blocking you. It is protecting the space where coherence has not yet formed. When the system has withdrawn authority from the old narrative, decoupled thought from action, tolerated silence, and resisted premature replacement, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is a different configuration of agency, one that feels unfamiliar because it operates without the structures you used to rely on. This is often the most misunderstood part of the threshold. From the outside, it can look like passivity. From the inside, it can feel like nothing is happening, but something fundamental has shifted. Action is no longer being driven by identity maintenance. You are no longer acting in order to confirm who you are, justify past effort, or preserve continuity with an outdated version of yourself. Agency becomes smaller, quieter, and more precise. Before, your sense of self extended into the future. You acted based on who you believed you were becoming, or who you needed to remain. That projection created momentum. It also created pressure. Now that projection has collapsed. The future no longer exerts the same pull. The past no longer demands consistency. What remains is the present, stripped of narrative obligation. This can feel disorienting because so much of what you call drive was actually borrowed from identity. Without that borrowing, action no longer feels automatic. It has to be justified by immediate relevance rather than long-term story. You may notice that you still act, but differently. You respond when something clearly requires response. You disengage when it doesn't. There is less compulsion to optimize, improve, or explain yourself. Not because you've rejected responsibility, but because responsibility is no longer framed through an identity that needs reinforcement. This is why this phase can feel strangely calm and heavy at the same time. Calm, because the internal pressure to become or prove has eased. Heavy, because there is no longer a narrative lifting you forward. Agency here is not expansive. It does not feel empowering in the conventional sense. It feels local. You deal with what is directly in front of you. You notice when something is genuinely required and when it is merely expected. The difference becomes clearer. This clarity does not come with enthusiasm. It comes with neutrality. You are no longer pulled by imagined outcomes. You are no longer driven by internal promises that cannot be verified. You are present with what is actually occurring, and you respond only to that. For many people, this feels like a loss of ambition. But ambition was often tied to continuity, an idea of self-extending across time. When continuity dissolves, ambition quiets. What replaces it is not aimlessness, but accuracy. You do less, but what you do is cleaner. This is also where the illusion of constant self-improvement falls away. Improvement assumes a stable reference point. It assumes you know who you are and where you're going. At the threshold, those assumptions no longer hold. Without them, improvement becomes irrelevant. This can feel like regression if you measure yourself against your previous standards. But those standards belong to an identity that no longer governs. Measuring yourself by them now only creates distortion. Agency here is not about advancing. It is about not lying to yourself. You are no longer acting to sustain coherence that has already dissolved. You are acting only when action makes sense without explanation. This is why decisions feel fewer and heavier. You don't make them to reduce discomfort. You make them when they are unavoidable. This returns agency in a different form, not as momentum, but as restraint, not as certainty, but as refusal to pretend. You still choose, but choice is no longer inflated by narrative meaning. It is grounded in immediate alignment. You choose to engage or not engage, to speak or remain silent, to continue or pause. These choices are small, but they are real. And because they are real, they don't need justification. This is the edge most people try to escape. They rush to rebuild identity because standing here feels exposed. There is no storyline to hide behind, no future version of yourself to excuse the present, no grand explanation to make discomfort meaningful. But this exposure is also stabilization. Without narrative distortion, perception becomes more honest. You notice what actually affects you and what doesn't. You stop overreacting to imagined consequences. You stop underreacting to real ones. The signal-to-noise ratio improves. This is not transcendence. It is sobriety. The self that remains here is not larger or more enlightened. It is reduced to what still functions without narrative support. That reduction can feel like loss, but it is also clarity. Nothing is being asked of you at this point. No leap, no reinvention, no commitment to a new story. You are simply standing where the old one no longer reaches. Agency has not disappeared. It has contracted to its most honest form, and that is where the threshold holds. What you are experiencing does not need to be resolved right now. There is a strong temptation to treat this phase as a problem that must be explained, corrected, or outgrown, to assume that stillness means delay and uncertainty means error. But nothing here is malfunctioning. Something has ended, and something else has not yet taken shape. The loss of narrative authority is not a collapse of self. It is the withdrawal of an outdated structure. You are not waiting because you are incapable of moving. You are waiting because movement without alignment would only recreate the same fracture in a different form. This pause does not belong to the past or the future. It exists outside of both. The old identity no longer commands you, and the next one has not earned that role yet. That in-between is uncomfortable precisely because it offers no direction, no validation, no explanation that feels solid. And yet, you are still here. You are perceiving clearly. You are responding when response is required. You are not pretending certainty where none exists. That is not absence of agency. That is agency stripped of illusion. Nothing in this moment asks you to define yourself again. Nothing asks you to commit to meaning prematurely. The most accurate position is the one you are already in, aware, unassigned, and present. The threshold does not demand crossing. It demands honesty about where you are standing. And for now, that is enough.